calculating a modified version of the CBO score for Build Back Better. In their version, it included extensions of programs without being paid for, which we understand is not how the president put forward this legislation. But the reason that they're saying they did that is because Lindsey Graham says if you believe these programs are going to go away after 1 or 2 years, you shouldn't have a driver's license. We all know child tax credits are not going to go away after a year. What does the White House say to that?
Well, to quote of all people Norm Ornstein at the American Enterprise Institute, who put this quite well, quote, "You can't assume programs will be extended just because Lindsey Graham wants to assure that. An estimate based on what's not in the bill is bogus and fundamentally dishonest." I mean, this is not a CBO score. This is a fake CBO score. It's not about the existing bill anybody is debating or voting on. This is about proposing the extension of programs that has not been agreed to without the commitment of the president, which he's made repeatedly publicly, that he would never support extending these programs if they weren't paid for, period. That has been his commitment. That is his commitment. I would also note that there's a particular irony here that it shouldn't be lost on Senator Graham. Maybe it is lost on Senator Graham. I don't know. That the plan they proposed and passed into law, the 2017 tax cuts, were $2 trillion, which were not paid for in any way, shape, or form. That didn't seem to upset them at all. And I will say, and they can thank us in any way they would like for this, that what our projections and the projections of our economists predict is that for our plan, as this plan continues in the second decade, it would actually reduce the deficit by $2 trillion. So we're actually covering their irresponsible tax cuts to corporations and net wealth individuals. They're very welcome for that.
Thank you.
So here's the latest brazenly shameless Republican scheme. They know that the Build Back Better Act is too popular to campaign against, and they know that it's fully paid for. And so now, Republicans, led by Senator Lindsey Graham, have asked the CBO to estimate the cost of the bill if the provisions continued beyond what the bill actually stipulates. All of this is being done, of course, to inflate its impacts on the deficit and make it seem as if the bill costs more than it actually does. But the problem is that the CBO is scoring a bill that doesn't exist, because the provisions in Build Back Better are not going for as long as this hypothetical scoring would suggest. They're all set to sunset at certain times. So Republicans' big plan to try and make it seem like the Build Back Better Act isn't paid for is by commissioning a CBO report to estimate the cost of a different bill that is literally not the Democrats' bill. And I'm not gonna lie, that probably doesn't bode well for that bill passing, which might be a problem if it actually existed. And by the way, here's a little trick. If you're confident that the Build Back Better Act doesn't pay for itself, like Republicans are wrongly claiming, why do you need to invent a fake bill for the CBO to score? Not for nothing, but if the Build Back Better Act actually did add to the deficit, then Republicans would just stick with that. The fact that they needed to conjure up a new bill to attack gives the entire ballgame away. And so now, as expected, Republicans are engaging in a full court press against the Build Back Better Act by claiming that it's way too expensive, all based on the CBO score of an entirely different, non-existent bill. But that part doesn't matter, since Republicans operate in a closed feedback loop and no one's actually going to bother to tell the truth. And so now we've got people like Sean Hannity lying outright, live on air, on the biggest quote-unquote news network on television, because he's banking on his viewers being too ignorant to know the truth.
We're lying. Kamala was lying, Joe was lying, Jen Psaki was lying, Schumer was lying, Pelosi was lying. All the Democrats were lying because they were using accounting gimmicks to sell this lie to you, the American people. Now, of course, by the way, recently we had Jen Psaki had a very different explanation. She circled back with and said the CBO isn't very experienced at scoring these kinds of socialist spending sprees.
Now, of course, Hannity and the rest of his Fox colleagues that cover this will run wild with this idea that the Democrats were lying when they said the Build Back Better Act was paid for. The irony being that he's lying because it is paid for, and it's an imaginary bill with imaginary provisions that's not fully paid for. But I do want to address one topic that does require explanation, and that's using the CBO score versus the Treasury to estimate revenue from IRS enforcement. Now, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, scored the bill as costing $367 billion without IRS enforcement, meaning the revenue the IRS would bring in by beefing up tax enforcement to deal with tax cheats. With IRS enforcement, the CBO estimated $127 billion in revenue. But the Treasury Department also offered an estimate for revenues for tax enforcement that's believed to be more accurate because the Treasury has more experience scoring IRS enforcement, and that number came out to $480 billion. So $367 billion in costs, offset by $480 billion in revenues, is a net reduction in the deficit of $113 billion over 10 years. Meaning, yes, it's paid for, and yes, Sean Hannity and his Republican toadies are lying. And one last point here. Even if the provisions were extended, they're not, but let's just humor Republicans on their imaginary journey here. Even if the provisions were extended and made permanent, why would Democrats not take the exact same approach they took here, which is quite simply to offset those costs? We literally paid for this bill. I just explained how the deficit will be reduced from the Build Back Better Act. And yet Republicans are presenting this whole gotcha, like if the programs were extended, the Democrats wouldn't simply find pay-fors, just like they did this time. I mean, come on, I know they're down to cook up scandals, but pretending that the Democrats won't simply use the exact same strategy they're using at this very moment is just lazy. If you're gonna gaslight, at least put some effort into it. And look, besides all of their tenuous talking points and deflections and scheming, it's pretty telling that Republicans are campaigning against everything except what's actually in the bill, and that speaks volumes. It's because they know that this bill is too popular. They know that universal pre-K is popular, childcare is popular, elder care is popular, lower insulin costs, capping healthcare at $2,000 a year for seniors, child tax credits, college grants, ACA subsidies, housing funding, paid leave, hearing aids, and so instead, they'll wail about what else but the deficit. Even though when they were in control of the government, their only major piece of legislation was a tax cut for the rich that not only wasn't even close to being paid for, but added $2 trillion to the deficit. $2 trillion. And yet now, when it's a bill to help regular middle-class Americans and not their ultra-wealthy pals, suddenly they're deficit hawks again. Convenient, huh? So while Republicans are cooking up fake bills to campaign against, just remember what they're trying to deprive you of. Just remember that while they were willing to blow up the deficit to give the top 1/10% a cool $250,000 on average to stash away, they're not willing to give seniors hearing aids and 3- and 4-year-olds pre-K, even though it won't add anything to the deficit. When they were rewarding themselves, they were happy to pass on those costs to you. But when you might stand to benefit, well, they'll pull out every stop in the book to ensure that that doesn't happen. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.